Good afternoon. Today we'll be starting the new paper on working capital management, which is MMPF 001 code. So we'll be talking about the conceptual framework of working capital management. The working capital management is a part of the financial management, and as we know, the financial management consists of both the fixed asset management as well as the current asset management. The working capital management is the science that deals with the current asset management. Now, we'll be surprised to know that about 50% of the total assets invested in a corporation that is current assets. And so the management of this particular current asset means proper management of this current asset means that the organization will be efficiently managed. So the importance of working capital management can never be overemphasized. And the working capital, which is basically what we know about working capital, is the total of the current assets. Some people define it as total of current assets, whereas some other people define it as the excess of current asset over the current liabilities. The first concept is known by the name of gross concept of working capital, and we call it the economic aspect of your working capital management. The second aspect, that is the excess of current asset over current liability, also goes by the name of the accounting concept of working capital. So the economic concept is, it talks about the fact that since we are using the entire of current asset for production, so the profit is a function of the total of current asset. So the total value of the current asset is taken into account when we talk about the working capital management. Whereas in case of the accounting concept, that is a net concept, the excess of current asset over current liability, that is, we're looking at the liquidity position of the current assets. So it is authors vary between use of current asset, gross assets or net assets, depending on the usage that they find for the working capital requirement. Now, when we talk about the constituents, what constitutes the working capital? So obviously, I'm talking about both the current asset as well as the current liability. If I'm using the gross concept, I'm talking about the total of current asset, and if I'm talking about the net concept, I'm talking about the current asset minus the current liabilities. Now, what constitutes current assets? In current assets, we have number one is inventories. Now, we also know this by the name of stocks. So, what is there in the inventories? In inventories, we have the raw materials. The packing materials is also considered a part of the raw material. We have work in process, that means products which have entered the production process and but have not come out as finished goods. Work in process, and then you have finished goods. Then the stores and spares are also considered a part of your inventories. Then we have sundry debtors, like we know it by the name of bills receivable. For goods that have been sold, but the bills have not been collected or the amount has not been collected, we call that as the sundry debtors. Then we have the cash and bank balance, which is a very important concept of the current asset. So the cash we have in hand and the bank balances that we have in various banks, that also goes as the basically we're talking about the current accounts and deposit accounts. So that is qualified as the cash and bank balance. The loans and advances, both secured as well as unsecured loans, and the advances that have been paid are also a part of the current assets. Similarly, we have current liabilities. In current liabilities, we have creditors, sundry creditors. For example, the supplier of material who has supplied us material but has not, the payment of the material has not been done, so that is sundry creditors. We have short-term credits, for example, the various kinds of short-term loans, the cash credit from the bank and all. And then we have also provisions, the provisions that we make for the taxation, the provision that we make for the dividend payment, and all sorts of provisions are a part of the current liabilities. So this is the component of our various working capital, current asset component and the current liability component. Then when we talk about the types of working capital, basically there are two types of working capital. One is a permanent working capital, the other one is a temporary working capital. Now the permanent working capital is a concept which is the capital, though we call it a working capital means current. So any asset which is to be converted within one accounting year is known as the current asset. So then one is to be confused, what is a permanent current asset? The permanent current assets are those current assets which are blocked in the due course of in the business, and when the as the business is a going concern, so one cycle of production ends and the other cycle immediately starts. And so it is not like after one cycle the current asset will be all finished up and then we'll start a new cycle. No, some amount of, for example, some amount of inventory, some amount of sundry debtors, some amount of advances will always be in the system, blocked in the system. The minimum amount which is required, which is blocked in the system as current assets, while the company is a going concern, that particular component is known as the permanent working capital. And this remains more or less stable, whether the product is seasonal or not. This requirement more or less remains stable. Whereas the temporary or the variable working capital, as it is also known as, is the circulatory or the transitory working capital. Now, this investment is required to take care of the fluctuations in the business activities. So, for example, if we talk about a product which is very, very seasonal in nature, for example, AC, fan, or for that matter, sweaters, which are completely seasonal. So there will be peak seasons and there will be off seasons. So in the peak seasons, the product sale will be very high. So the production has to be stepped up, and accordingly, the working capital requirement will also step up. And in the days of off season, the production will be lesser and the requirement will be lesser. So this temporary, the variable working capital will be lesser. So as you can see in the graph, the permanent or the regular working capital, it remains more or less stable, and whereas the temporary or the variable working capital fluctuates over and above that permanent working capital. Now, however, the behavior of working capital, as far as the permanent or the temporary working capital goes, the behavior of working capital is not always the same. I am giving you example of a farm which can be a non-growth, can be a non-seasonal or a non-cyclical. So there is no growth for the farm. It is doing business at a steady pace. The products of the farm are non-seasonal by nature, and the farm is non-cyclical. That is, it is not affected by the business cycle or the economic ups and downs. It is not affected by that. So it is non-cyclical by nature. Though the examples of this particular kind of farms will be quite rare, but if a farm falls into this particular category, you can see I am showing you a graph, whereas the sector A or the north-west quadrant of this particular graph shows you the behavior of the permanent working capital. In fact, the entire working capital of this particular farm is permanent by nature, because there is no growth, no seasonality, and non-cyclicality. So the entire nature of the working capital is permanent. So you have a single straight line running parallel to the x-axis. Now if you have a farm which is growing, but it is non-seasonal and non-cyclical. In that case, there will be no fluctuation in the working capital, but there will be steady growth of the working capital. Again, the entire working capital will be permanent by nature, but it will be gradually growing, as you can see in the right quadrant, that is the quadrant B in the particular graph. Then you can have a farm which is growing, which is seasonal, and which is non-cyclical. So if you have this kind of a farm, then the working capital will be, the permanent working capital will be gradually growing, whereas the variable working capital will be slightly fluctuating over and above that. The extreme case, you have the growing, seasonal, and cyclical farm, where the variable working capital will be drastically fluctuating. So obviously, it is quite difficult for anybody to predict the requirement of working capital. If the farm is growing, it is seasonal, it is cyclical, and it is very easy for a farm which is not growing, which is not cyclical, which is not seasonal. So this is how the working capital behaves depending on the nature of the farm. Now, if you talk about the cyclical flow of how the current assets they move in a particular farm, the movement of current asset in a farm can be shown as a cyclical flow. Now, I'm categorizing the farms into manufacturing farm, the retail farm, and the financing farm. The manufacturing farms, any business activity which does the entire A to Z of manufacturing. For example, you can talk about a steel plant. When I'm talking about retailing farm, they don't produce, they procure merchandise and they repackage it and sell it off. So it is a retailing farm. For example, you can talk about a garment industry. When we talk about financing firm, we can say it's a, let us say, a banking firm. It goes as a financing firm. Now, the cyclical flow of the current assets in these three firms is quite different. Now, the cycle I'm showing you in this particular slide, it is a typical representation of a current asset flow in a manufacturing firm, where we use the cash. You can see we start with the cash. I use the cash to buy raw material. So the process between cash and raw material will be procurement or the purchase of raw material or acquisition of raw material. Then the raw material will be processed, will be put into the production process. And obviously, I have not shown you a step which is a work in process. It is understood the process from raw material to finished good is a production process. So we come up with the finished goods. Now, finished goods are not immediately sold because finished goods also stay in the inventory for a certain number of days before which they are actually sold off. Now, when they are sold off, the accounts receivable are created. Now, when we are selling the finished goods, we are not selling it on some of it, we sell it on cash, but the majority of it, we sell it on credit basis. So we basically create bills receivable or accounts receivable. Now, once we collect the accounts receivable, when the collection happens, we get back the cash. In case of a retail farm, this particular cyclical flow goes a change, that is the raw material and finished good that combinedly becomes the merchandise. So we have cash, procurement of merchandise, then accounts receivable, collection, and then back to cash. If I'm talking about the financing firm, like a bank, the raw material and the finished good part is absent. So we use the cash to create debtors. Basically, we give it as a loan, create debtors, and then we collect the cash with some interest or something, and then we get back to the cash. So these steps keep on reducing from manufacturing to financing. Now the point is, when we talk about this particular cyclical flow, the each of this cycle, it results in we start with some amount of cash and we end with a different amount of cash. Now, if you're ending with a cash which is higher than the starting amount of cash, suppose I started with the 100 rupee cash and my collections are 120, that is including the profit part. So in each cycle, I will be making a profit of 20 rupees. So now the point that is to be noted here is when I'm talking about working capital management, I'm basically talking about how fast this particular cycle is moving, and with each cycle, how much of profit I'm generating. So obviously, if the cycle rotates faster, and if it rotates faster, then suppose it rotates 5 times in a year, so I make 20 into 5, 100 rupees profit. If the cycle rotates 10 times in a year, that means faster turnover happens for this particular materials. My profit will grow to 10 into 20, that is 200. So this is with efficient management of working capital, I can achieve this particular objective of farm of generating maximum profit. Now, now that we know about the cyclical flow of the current assets, now there are typical characteristics of this working capital. I think you are already aware of it, that the current assets have a very, very short lifespan. It is converted into cash the turnover happens within 1 year. Though there are certain items where the turnover doesn't take place within a year. For example, inventory. Still, for all practical purposes, we call it a current asset, and normally all the current assets are a very very short lifespan. Now you have so the assets undergo very very swift transformation, and there are interrelated asset forms. Now, what do we mean by this swift transformation? As we saw here, the cash transforms into raw material, which transforms into finished good, transforms into bills receivable, then collected to back to cash again. So the transformation from cash to back again to cash happens very very swiftly. Maybe within a period of 90 days, maybe within a period of 120 days. So depending on the days that the cycle is completed. And these assets are all very interrelated, because you see, once I am using cash, my cash level is depleted, but my raw material will be increased. Now, when the raw material converts into finished good, my raw material inventory will get reduced, but the finished good inventory will go up. So, likewise, all the asset forms are interrelated among themselves. Obviously, then talk about the insynchronization of activity levels. The working capital, the activities may not be very synchronized. For example, I am using cash to get raw material, to buy raw material, but at the same time I'm not also collecting the cash. So which means, suppose collection gives rise to cash inflow, whereas purchase of raw material gives rise to cash outflow. This outflow and inflow are not synchronized. Because they are not synchronized, will require the working capital to be funded, and the financing of working capital is needed, because these activities are not synchronized. Now, when we talk about obviously now that you have understood the planning, why the working capital is needed for an organization, like we talked about, the working capital is absolutely important for efficient management of an organization. So we need definitely tools for planning of this working capital. Now, when we talk about planning, as we know, anything that is well planned, half the battle is won. So for any management activity, we always start with the planning aspect. So when I'm talking about working capital management, again, I'll have to talk about the planning of working capital. Now that we know how important the working capital concept is, we'll have to plan for the working capital. Now, when planning, again, as you might have read in other papers of management, that the planning could take place in a short-term horizon, or for a medium-term horizon, or for a long-term horizon. So in terms of a short-term planning, we talk about a tool called cash budgeting. Now, we'll read more details about a cash budget when we talk about the management of cash and the receivables. We'll be dealing in details with the cash budget then. But for time being, what is a cash budget it's a tool which talks about the inflows, the receipts, and the payments of an organization. Now, you can prepare a cash budget for the whole year and break it down to monthly or fortnightly or even a weekly, or some companies go even to a micro level as for planning the cash on a daily level. Now, why is the cash budget important? Now, the cash budget tells you that it will give you the exact timing when the fund will be, you will have surplus cash in hand, and exactly when you will have the requirement of funding. Now, because you're talking about the receipts and payments, so you borrow the budget from every department, like sales department, like the production department, the marketing department. You borrow the cash budget is prepared by borrowing from all the budgets of every department. So you have a feel of the requirement of the cash for different departments, and you also have a feel of what are the cash I'm going to get during a particular period of time. Now, the payments and receipts then are written down, so that you in a particular period you have a idea of how much cash I'm receiving in this particular period vis-a-vis how much cash is to be paid in that particular year. Now, suppose if you have more receipts than payments, so you will have a surplus. And in a period, if you have more payments than receipts, you will have a deficit. Now, the surplus, when you have a figure of a feel about the surplus or a deficit, obviously the surplus will not be kept idle in the farm, because the surplus funds, you will lose out on interest, you will lose out on the returns that you could have generated, so it becomes idle. So the surplus fund is to be invested. And when we talk about deficit, I have to borrow, I have to arrange for short term. Suppose the deficit arises for a period of 15 days. So I have to be prepared from begin from the period beforehand, so that I can borrow the amount for a 15-day period. Now, obviously, if I know about the duration when I'm going to borrow, I will not fall prey to the various bargaining and negotiation techniques of various financial institutions. If I don't know when I require the cash, and suddenly, suppose today I come to know that in a day or two, my organization requires an amount of 5 lakh rupee on an urgent basis. And if I don't know the sources, I'll fall prey to the bargaining techniques, where I'll end up paying a very, very high rate of interest for a short-term loan. But if I am prepared beforehand that this is the duration for which I'm going to borrow, and I'll have a discussion with my sources, my bankers, and all. So I'll arrange the loans before the deficit arises. So this is how the cash budget helps me in actually planning for the working capital. This and the details of the technique, I guess, will be discussing in the cash and receivable management. Then we have the short medium term planning. Now this determines, this is a mathematical process, how we talk about the requirement of working capital is actually done, and we'll be doing it in the I think the module 3 will be actually calculating how the working capitals are determined. So for the time being, we'll skip this particular discussion. And then we have long-term planning. I guess you have already discussed this long-term planning in terms of CVP and the funds flow analysis in your accounting and your costing statements, where we talk about the cost volume profit analysis. Now, we do it in an organization, you always have an eye on the cost and the revenue factor. When we're talking about the working capital, the cost of the inventory and the revenue that we're generating from the inventory, or the, for example, other current assets, the cost and revenue aspect is always kept on the horizon for decision making. And instead of the break-even analysis, where we talk about the level of sales or level of production, here we talk about the break-even point in terms of cash. Like at what level of sales, what volume of sales, the cash used up for creating the sales and the sales revenue, they are constant. So we have an eye on that thing in case of CVP analysis in working capital management. Again, in funds flow analysis, we have seen that what matters the most is that the funds generated from the operations it matters the most when we're talking about the working capital analysis. So you have done funds flow analysis elsewhere. So we'll not discuss much about the long-term planning here in case of working capital. So then we'll talk about an important aspect, that is how does the inflation affect the working capital. Now, as we know, the inflation after independence, the inflation was quite high, in excess of 30% for quite a long period of time. About the first 30 years after independence, we saw inflation hovering over and above 30%. And with continuous prudential banking norms and prudential financial management at the macro level, it has been brought down substantially now, the inflation, and the inflation is hovering around some 5 to 7%, 8% in the range in these days. By the way, what is inflation? Someone can ask you. The inflation is the rising prices of commodities. Now, then why the inflation will have some kind of a role in terms of working capital? Now, as we know, the inflation has a very important role in working capital because it affects the size of the working capital, it affects the availability of working capital, it also affects the various components of working capital. Now, we'll discuss each one of them individually now. Now, when we talk about inflation, what is inflation? The input prices are rising. So, what will happen is if the inflation is very high, there will be obviously spot in the prices of input factors. So what will happen is we will end up investing more in the current assets. For example, buying more of suppose we were earlier buying 100 units of raw material at 500 rupees. Now we'll be using, let us say, 800 rupees to buy the same 100 rupees of 100 units of the raw material. So there will be no increase in the volume of the level of activity, but the investment in the current asset will increase without necessarily an increase in the volume of activity. It is understood that if the volume of activity goes up, if you are producing more, then obviously your investment in working capital will be more. But inflation will ensure that the level of activity remaining constant, the amount of investment required for working capital will go up. So that is one thing that will happen from the spot in the prices of input factors. Then what will happen is that because of this inflation, even the price of the end product will also go up, and because the price of the end product has gone up, there will be higher profits. Now this motivation for higher profit will now induce the manufacturers to increase their volume of operation. So obviously, because the prices of the commodities are running very high, the manufacturers will be motivated to produce more. And obviously, the first thing I said is that at the same level of activity, your input cost will go up. That means the investment in raw material will go up. Next, because the manufacturer is now motivated to go for higher profits, they will now increase the level of production. Now, because of the increase in the level of production, again, your investment in the current asset will go up. Now, because the investment is in current asset is going up, now you have two things. The investment in current asset is going up twofolds. One, at the constant level due to the prices. Second, the volume increases. Again, you have twofold increase in the investment in the current assets. Now, another thing will happen, it's a vicious thing that will happen is because now the prices of commodities or the raw input is continuously rising. For example, raw material. When I know that the raw material price is continuously increasing, that every month there is a 5% or 10% increase in the inventories, then I have a tendency to procure more of inventory. I will not wait for the future to buy at a higher price, the per unit cost of raw material. I will not wait for a period where I have to buy the raw material at a higher price. So what I'll do is I'll try to buy it even if I don't need it, even if I need it in 2 months or 3 months time. I will start accumulating and start buying raw material which is not needed today, but it will be needed in 3 months time or 4 months time. So what will happen is there will be an accumulation of inventory during this inflationary period. So it will ensure that my working capital requirement goes up again. So see, there are three things that I have talked about where you have increasing pressure on the working capital requirement of a farm. Now next is we have in India, we have the financial reporting practice. As per the Companies Act and the Income Tax Act, the historical costs are usually set against the current prices and the inventories are valued at the current prices. So this leads to a scenario where the higher level of profit is reported, but the higher level of profit does not necessarily mean in actual profit. These are not actual profit, but the reporting of, there will be higher reporting of profit. Because there will be higher profits will be reported, the company will be under pressure to shell out more as tax and to go for more provisioning for the dividend. Now, if you are provisioning for more for tax and more for dividend, and you are paying more of dividend because you are earning higher profit, again your cash reserve is going down. So that puts the further pressure on the cash reserve of the organization. So basically what I'm trying to tell you here is the inflation creates a cycle. The overall investment in the input, basically the raw material, the overall investment in the raw material goes up because of several interrelated factors that we discussed just now. Now, again, how does it affect the availability of working capital? Now, as we saw that suppose I was maintaining about 1.5 lakh for my working capital on a regular basis. Now, that 1.5 lakh will not be sufficient because the input cost has gone up, and because of the points we just discussed, there is huge pressure on the working capital. So my internal resources will not be sufficient. So the availability of my internal sources get reduced. Now, what happens is in a inflationary period, the government and the Reserve Bank of India, they have to walk a very tight line. They have to walk a very tight line to control the inflation, because inflation gives rise to a lot of other social problems as well. So what happens is the Reserve Bank of India then tightens the monetary policy, because it has been seen in the past that if with a tight monetary policy, the availability of cash, it is sucked up from the economic environment, and because there is less of cash, the automatically the consumption comes down, and because of the consumption coming down, the inflation also comes down. So the RBI is forced to go for a tight monetary policy. And because of the tight monetary policy, the credit facilities that the banks were earlier providing, they are no more able to provide that credit facility. So the organizations will have a two-pronged problem now. One, the internal sources are not available; they are not sufficient. Two, the availability of external credit is also reduced from the banks, which was earlier available, now it is no more available. Now the last thing that the companies will face the pressure is the tightening of trade credit. Now, well, what is trade credit here? Trade credit means the credit which automatically arises in the due course of business. That is, for example, I'm selling things on credit basis, so I'm creating bills receivable. Similarly, the raw material that I am procuring or the purchasing, the raw material is the supplier of raw material is also supplying to me on credit basis. So automatically this particular credit that is created, which is known as the trade credit. Now the point is, even the supplier of raw material, he is also feeling the pressure of inflation. So what he will try to do is he will tighten his the credit line. So what will the manufacturing firm will feel that pinch as well, where the trade credit is no more available. So on the one hand, you have huge requirement of working capital because of inflation. On the other hand, the working capital is not anymore available. So the farm is basically sandwiched between this problem. Number one, it is required. Number two, it is not available. Then the working capital also has a very, very typical influence on the various components of working capital. Now we will see what is the basically it is affecting the inventory to a great extent. So what happens is, as we just saw now, the farm which was procuring the level of inventory at a particular, suppose the inventory was per unit cost was 5 rupee and I had 5,000 rupee, so I was able to buy 1,000 units of inventory. Now if the raw material price goes up to 8 rupee, I have to procure 1,000 units, then I'll have to sell out 8,000 rupee. So which means that my requirement is constant, but now I'll have to invest more in the inventory because of inflation. So it will lead to over investment in inventory. Then the next one is, it again results in shortages, because as in the previous slide, as I said, because of the inflationary pressures, all the manufacturers, they will try to buy excess amount of inventory to avoid further rise in prices. So when I know that the inventory is increasing in value every month, then I'll have a tendency to procure 3 months or 4 months or 6 months of inventory in advance. So if everybody is trying to buy in advance, obviously the supply pool is constant. So if everybody is trying to buy in advance, there will be a huge shortage in the supply of raw material. So the raw material will not be available. Or for that matter, this finished good, if I'm talking about a trading farm. Now it does affect the valuation of inventory, because the inflation, as we know, the prices are rising, the valuation of inventory also gets affected, the price of the cost of inventory also goes up. So, and the last and very important aspect is that the traditional inventory control techniques is rendered ineffective. Now, I'll try to explain this. This is a very, very important aspect and interesting one. So, I'll try to explain it in a little bit elaboration. So, to elaborate, let us first have a look at a small case study. Now, let us assume that the annual consumption of a farm is 1 lakh. And here I have not mentioned that the per unit cost of raw material is rupees 1. So if the annual consumption is 1 lakh units, my annual consumption is 1 lakh units into rupee 1. That is, annual consumption is rupees 1 lakh. So, and the economic order quantity, though it is quantity, I have mentioned it as in terms of rupees because the economic order quantity is 3,125, and because it is rupee 1 per unit cost, so again economic order quantity I have expressed in terms of cash, that is rupees 3125. Now, I am ordering, the number of orders I am placing per year is obviously the annual consumption divided by the EOQ quantity. It works out to 32 orders per year. Now, I have the ordering cost, that is rupees 20 per order. Now, I have the carrying cost, which is 25%. That is, you can talk about the per unit cost, 25%. Then you have, it is usually charged on the average inventory. So then your lead time is constant. I guess all of us are aware, but let me explain again what is the lead time. The lead time is the time, the gap between placing an order and receiving the order. So if I'm placing an order today for an item, for example, I buy something online. I place an order today, suppose today is 11th of March. I place an order today on 11th of March and I receive it on 18th of March. So the lead time is 7 days. And we are assuming that this particular lead time is constant. So every time I place an order, I receive it within 7 days. So it is constant. And to show the impact of inflation, I have inserted this price rise is 5% per month. So I'll go by simple calculations. I'll not go for the compound growth rate of 5%. I'll go with the simple growth rate of 5% to show you how the inflation impacts the EOQ. Now we know that traditionally for managing the inventory, we have been using the EOQ technique for efficiency in the dealing of inventory. Now, what will happen if we follow the EOQ? As we all know, the ordering cost, since per order cost is 20, the ordering cost is total ordering cost per year is 32 orders into 20. That is 640 rupees will be spent in a year for ordering the entire quantity of 1 lakh units. Now, carrying cost. In one lot, I am ordering 3125 units of raw material. So my average inventory is 3125 divided by 2. And the 25% is my carrying cost. So 25%, so that is 25 by 100. So the total works out to 390.63. So that is the carrying cost per year. Now my total cost works out to 640 plus 390.63, and that works out to 1030.63 as the total cost of carrying and ordering the inventory. Now we'll see if as per this EOQ, if we place 32 orders in a year, the distribution of the same in each month and the material cost month wise I have shown you. And for this, only the sake of exposition here, there is no hard and fast rule of how many orders are being placed. I have done it because 32 divided by 12, it is not a perfectly divisible number. So what I have done is, in some months I have placed 2, some months I have placed 3. Like that, I have distributed the 32 into the 12 months, like in this particular fashion. So first month I placed 2 orders, and the material cost is in each order I am placing 3125 into 2 orders. So this is the number of units I am ordering, and the cost of the material is 1. So this works out to 6,225. Likewise, in the second month, I am placing 3 orders, and so the total number of units I am buying is 3125 per order into 3 orders. That is 9,843. So, and the per unit cost is now 5% higher, that is 1.05. So this is the total material cost. Again in the third month, this is the number of orders 3, and now the material cost has gone up by 5%. As I told you, I am not going by the compound increase, that is on 5% on 1.05. I am not charging. What I am doing is I am charging on the original price 1 of 1. So 5% on 1, 10% on 1, 15% on 1, like that I am doing. I am not going by the which I should have done, but for the sake of simplicity, what I have done is I have charged 5% over and above the basic price of rupees 1. Now you can see that in 12 months, as per the orders, this is how the material cost will look like. And now the total material cost, if we follow the model of EOQ, the total material cost works out to 1,27,656.25. So now the whole issue is that this is my as per the EOQ. Now as I told you, in inflationary cases, what companies try to do is they try to buy the inventory in advance. Even if it is not required right now, they buy 6 months, 10 months, 1 year of inventory in advance to avoid paying a higher price per unit. So based on the EOQ formula, we saw that the total material cost comes to 1,27,656.25, which consists of the material cost, the ordering cost, as well as the inventory cost. However, if a firm decides that no, I'll not enter into a scenario where I have to pay every month 5% extra, so the company decides to buy the entire lot of 1 lakh units in one go. So that is a possibility. So if we do that, what will be the case? The quantity needed for your 1 year is 1 lakh units. So you buy into 1, so that is 1 lakh rupees will be spent for the entire material. And here, how many number of orders you will place? You will place only 1 order. So the ordering cost is 20. 1 order into 20. So that is ordering cost is 20. Because as we know, ordering cost is fixed in nature. It doesn't depend on the size of your order, but it depends on the number of orders. Now, carrying cost, again, because you are ordering the entire amount in one go. So the average inventory that you are carrying is the total quantity divided by 2, that is 50,000 units. 25% on that, so that works out to 12,500. Now your material cost is 1 lakh, as we discussed right now. So what is your total cost? Your total cost is the total material cost 1 lakh, the ordering cost rupees 20, and the carrying cost, which is 12,500. Now you can see in EOQ your carrying cost was very low, whereas your ordering cost was quite high, because we are ordering in very frequently. 32 times we were ordering. Here we are ordering only once. So the total cost works out to 1,12,520. Now if you were the working capital manager of this particular firm, what would you do? Now if you order in one lot, your average average inventory cost is 1,12,000 some odd, and if you are following the scientific principle of EOQ, you are going to spend 1,27,000 some odd rupees. So obviously you will go for ordering in one lot. So what we see from this is that when the cost of commodities, cost of raw materials is increasing, then the EOQ model will not work. So the manufacturer will have a tendency to buy the entire lot of material in one go, and this leads to overinvestment in inventory at one point of time. So putting a lot of pressure on the working capital requirement of the firm. Now, as we said, it also has an effect on the receivables. Now, see, what is the impact on the receivables? Suppose I had sold some goods worth 10 lakh rupees 3 months back. Now, there is inflation going on. The inflation at a rate of 7 to 8% going on. So, because I had sold the 10 lakh rupees 3 months before, I am due to receive it today. Now, in 3 months, the inflation will ensure that my customer is paying me cheaper rupee value, because the 10 lakh rupee that was sold 3 months back due to the pressure of inflation. Now, if I am receiving 10 lakh rupee today, which I'll be receiving 10 lakh rupee today, the value of 10 lakh rupee is not same. The customer is benefited here by paying the 10 lakh rupee right now, because I am going to receive only a fraction of the value that I sold 3 months back. So the receivable will be again, I'll end up receiving the cheaper rupee value in terms of the because of the inflation. Now it also has an impact on the cash, because if all of us know, the inflation has a direct impact on the purchasing power of the cash. So if I am carrying 1 lakh rupee right now and inflation is going at a rate of let us say 8%, so the value of my money is not exactly 1 lakh rupee. That is, if I cannot buy the same basket of goods that I was buying today, after a year, if the inflation goes on a rate of 8%. So the value of cash also diminishes, the purchasing power of cash also diminishes due to the presence of inflation. So this is how the inflation has a very big role in terms of the working capital planning. Now, the last thing that for discussion today is the trend in working capital. Now, it is the RBI compiles the data for these various kinds of the sectors of farms, and prepares the various tables and ratios. Now, in terms of the size of the working capital, it has been seen that over a period of time, starting from the day when RBI has started compiling, from the last 10 years, it has been seen that there's a continuous increase in the size of working capital. That is, the net current asset to the total asset. The percentage of current asset to total asset has been continuously rising in the last 10 years. In 2018-19, this particular value was more than 35%. So which means if a company has an investment of 100 rupee, more than 35 rupee was in current asset. I guess the value right now is much more, around 50% today, in terms of the total assets and the current assets. Again, there is a ratio when we talk about current the working capital. There is a ratio that talks about, is also known as the current working capital ratio, which is a current ratio. Now, the current ratio, which is a current asset by current liabilities, the prudency says, financial prudency says that the ratio is to be maintained at a level of 2:1. That is, the current assets should be twice the size of your current liability. Also ensures that the bills could be paid on time. It also ensures that the good liquidity position of a farm. It also ensures that your financial health is doing well. However, it has been seen that the public companies in India, they are not showing a very healthy ratio as far as the current ratio is concerned. So the it has been seen the ratio is around 1:1, or sometimes 1.1:1. So we have a long way to go in terms of maintaining a healthy ratio of 2:1 as far as this working capital trend is concerned. And if we talk about the constituent of working capital, maybe 20 years back, the highest component of working capital was inventory. It was about, it will be surprised to know, the current the inventory occupied the primary position at a level of around 60% of the current asset was blocked in inventory. This did not show a very healthy trend, because, as you know, inventory is something that is very difficult to turn over into cash. It requires a long time to be converted into cash. So that is why when we compute a cash ratio or a quick ratio, we first deduct the the inventory part. Over a period of time, it has been seen that this particular trend has been reduced, and now the inventory has been relegated to the second position, and the first position has been taken up by this is a very heartening thing to happen in Indian financial market, that now the number one position in terms of working capital is taken up by the debtors or bills receivable. It is occupying the predominant position at 35%. More than 50% is your this debt, and the second position has been the inventory. So this overall shows the improvement of working capital management practices in India, where the inventory has not been occupying the this particular level. So I guess this finishes our the working capital, the introduction to working capital. To at the end, to just summarize what we did today, let me again go through the summary slides, that we talked about why is a working capital important. Working capital, because it is about 50% of the total investment in of a farm. So you cannot afford to underestimate the current assets, because they are short term in nature. So managing working capital is the companies which have been perfectly managing the working capital are considered the good companies these days. Now, so working capital, we talked about the concepts of working capital. Now, we talked about the gross concept, which is the economic concept. We talked about the working capital net concept, which is the accounting concept. We talked about the importance of both these concepts. Then we also talked about the various constituents of working capital, the current assets and the current liabilities. The total current assets or the gross current assets are known as the gross working capital, and the current assets minus current liabilities are known as the net current asset or the net working capital. Then we also talked about the permanent working capital as well as the variable working capital. Which is the permanent working capital is the minimum amount of working capital that is always blocked in a business, known as the permanent working capital, and the fluctuating over and above the permanent working capital, the fluctuating working capital is known as the temporary or the variable working capital. And we also seen that the permanent and temporary working capital, how do they behave in terms of different farms. 4 different kinds of farms we have seen, and what is the behavior of this permanent and temporary working capital, that also we have seen. Again, how the working capital turns over in a particular farm. The current asset has a cyclical nature, in how we saw in case of a manufacturing farm, the retailing farm, and the financing farm. We saw how the current assets turns over in a cycle, and how we saw that efficient management of working capital means the faster turnover of this particular cycle, and through proper management we can also have more profits generated, so through each turning of the cycle. Now, obviously, if your company is not making good profit or making a loss, then obviously you would want the cycle to slow down. But if you are making profit, you would want the cycle to turn over faster. And how we saw this cycle undergoes changes, modifications, if it's a manufacturing farm or a retail farm or a financing farm. Now, again, the characteristics based on this particular cyclical flow, we saw that they have short lifespan, they transform very swiftly, they are interrelated, and there is no synchronization in the activity levels, for which we require the working capital. And working capital planning can be done on 3 levels: the short term, the medium term, and the long term. The long term planning is done by this cost, volume, profit, and the funds flow, which you have already discussed elsewhere. The short term planning, cash budgeting, will be discussing in details. We just saw a snapshot of what a cash budget is. We'll be dealing with the details of cash budget in cash planning, cash management. And we talked about the medium term planning of this. This actually deals with how we determine the working capital requirement of a farm, which we'll be seeing in the subsequent units of this particular module. Then we also discussed how the inflation affects the working capital. The inflation has a deep impact on the size of the working capital, and then it has also impact on the availability of working capital and the various components of working capital. Now, while discussing the components, we also highlighted how the inventory and the traditional techniques or the scientific techniques of inventory management is useless in terms of inflation. So the role of inflation can never be underestimated while talking about the working capital management. Now, we saw how the inventory, that, because of inflation, there will be overinvestment in your inventory. It will lead to various kind of shortages because everyone is purchasing. And why is everyone going to purchase? That we saw in the case study just now. The valuation of inventories will go up, and the EOQ techniques and all that, that will be rendered effective. How that is done, that we saw through this particular case study, that we saw that if a farm follows the EOQ technique, the farm will end up, though we have the name itself is EOQ, economic order quantity, which means that if we order in, and it has been scientifically calculated that if we order in those quantity levels, then the cost of the inventory will be minimal. But we saw just now that if we order, in case in inflationary scenario, if you are ordering in a single lot, probably your cost of inventory is much less as compared to ordering in the economic or so-called economic order quantity. So the inflation, the presence of inflation means that the working capital management has to be relooked in a different way of how to manage the inventory in a proper way. We also saw that the receivables are the customer is going to pay lesser rupee value of when he is paying in presence of inflation. The manufacturing firm which is selling on credit basis, is standing on the losing side, whereas the client who is buying on credit, he is standing on the winning side because he is ending up paying the lesser money value as compared to the price at which he has procured. Similarly, in terms of cash, the purchasing power of the cash is going down because due to rising price of commodities, the purchasing power of our cash is going down drastically. So basically we end up poorer because of inflation, and the cash reserve that we have will become insufficient due to the inflationary pressure. And we have also seen that there is a huge change in the trend of working capital in India. The size of working capital has been continuously increasing over a period of 10 years now, and from a level of, let us say, less than 30% to now it is increasing, it's touching towards 50% of the current asset to the total asset ratio. Now, obviously, the size of the working capital depends on the various kinds of industries that we're dealing with. The size of working capital, if we're dealing with a manufacturing firm, it will be different. If we're dealing with a trading firm, it will be different. If we're talking about a banking firm, similarly. If we're talking about in a manufacturing, also if we're talking about a heavy engineering industry, then the size of working capital will be different as compared to a firm which is probably producing services and all. So obviously, size of working capital depends on the nature of the working capital that nature of the firm that we're dealing with. And there is an increasing trend of the holding of the current assets in all these kinds of firms. And obviously, the constituent of the working capital, we saw that traditionally the inventory was occupying the predominant position in terms of the current assets. The change in the trend is more towards now the debtors and bills receivable. So which means that more of the working capital is being tied up in the debtor stage than the inventory stage, that is the raw material and the work in process or the finished goods stage. The more of the working capital is being tied up now in your debtors. So this signifies this trend, this signals towards a very, very healthy trend in terms of working capital management in India. So I guess the concept is clear to you. So we'll see the details about working capital management in the next session. Thank you.